Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the sounded out strategy for helping kids to read and spell. So, I'll first start off by saying that if you have ever been supporting a child who is having a hard time reading and spelling words, you know that when you tell them to sound it out, they don't always know exactly what that means. It doesn't always necessarily help them. Sometimes when kids get stuck, it can be hard to figure out how to support them through this strategy to actually figure out how do you spell a word, how do you read a word without just telling them the answer or having them memorize it. Now, if you're here, you might be an SLP. You might be aware that SLPs play a huge role in helping to develop literacy skills. Literacy is all of those skills that are required to read, to comprehend, to understand what individual words and sentences mean, all of those things that we need in order to be able to comprehend and make sense of what we're reading, all of those are language based skills. So SLPs are actually very well equipped to be supporting kids in developing literacy skills. But sometimes it can be kind of hard to figure out where exactly we intervene. So, what I'm going to do today is share one strategy that you can use or one place that you can focus that can help you to both leverage your expertise and to, number one, give kids a good strategy that they can use when they come to a word they don't know and when they are trying to spell a word and they're not really sure how to do it. And then also something that you can be sharing with other people that are supporting the kids that are on your caseload. And this could be people like parents that of kids that you work with. If they're reading with kids at home and you want to give them some strategies and tips for what they can do at home with their children, and then also something that you can kind of work into conversations with reading specialists and with teachers that you work with and special education teachers. Now, of course, with that second one, it can get a little bit tricky. You do have to be careful with how you go about sharing that information because you don't want to step on toes and tell people that they're doing things wrong. But I have, in my experience, over time, as you build relationships with people, you can get to the point where they're more open to your feedback, especially if they realize that you're a language expert. You can provide some support for some of those kids that you might both be working with. So I wanted to talk about the sounded out strategy because it's so common. It's something that we always say to kids when they're struggling, and you might know that it doesn't always work because kids don't always know what sounded out means. So let me talk a little bit about some of the things that are required in order for kids to be able to decode. And the thing about decoding is that is really important to fluency and comprehension. A lot of times people think, oh, well, comprehension is the end goal of reading, so why don't we just focus on that? You might have experienced that as well if you've got kids on your caseload that have language processing issues. But the problem is if you're devoting a lot of cognitive resources to figuring out what individual words are and you don't have automatic decoding, then that's going to utilize so many resources for thinking about how to sound words out that you're not going to have any bandwidth to think about the big picture and actually comprehend. So you can actually improve comprehension by improving decoding skills. So that's one thing to remember. And then when we think about decoding skills, what you need in order to be able to automatically decode is that you need good phonological awareness, you need good morphological knowledge, and then you need solid orthographic awareness as well so that words can become sight words and you can automatically just recall them and make sense of them when you see them. So what I'm going to talk about today is just one of those. I'm going to talk about phonological awareness, and in some lives coming up, I will get into some of the other pieces such as morphological knowledge, but I wanted to talk about phonological awareness and how it fits in with telling kids to sound it out. So when we are asking kids to sound it out, what we really want them to do is pay attention to the sounds that they're perceiving. So what we would typically consider as the phonemes or the speech sounds. So the sounds that they're perceiving and how they go together to form a word. So this would be relevant to words that are shorter, that are some of those early developing words that kids might need to be learning. So not necessarily as applicable to multimorphemic words yet. I will talk about that in some other videos, but we're talking about shorter words here. So, or at least shorter segments of words. So when we are asking kids to sound it out, we want them to think about the sounds, and then we also want them to pair that information with the written symbols of the words, which is getting into orthography, so understanding the spelling system of a language. So kids need to be able to pair those two things together in order to have good word attack. That is one strategy that they can use in order to figure out, how might I spell this word, or how might I read this word? And yes, there might be some times when kids might come up with spellings that aren't 100% accurate, but they're at least starting to use some of those strategies in order to come up with ways to spell words, and they're starting to understand the words. So what we really want kids to do is, number one, think about the sounds, and then number two, think about the letters that go with the sounds. So instead of telling kids to sound it out, what you could do instead is back up, and before you're starting to think about the actual print symbols, which would be the letters that go with the sounds and that represent the sounds, what you could do is back up and say, okay, let's think about the sounds in the words. And you could focus on some of those phonological awareness skills. So for example, if you were asking kids if they wanted to spell the word mop, for example, and they weren't quite sure how to do it, what you could do is say, okay, let's think about the sounds in that word. And you could say mop. You could segment it out. P. Get them to see if they can segment those sounds first and say p. Draw their attention to those sounds first. And then as they're saying those sounds, they can start to think about the letters that go with the sounds. So it's think about the sounds, p. Now let's think about the letters as we're saying those sounds. And you want to be saying those sounds out loud as you are saying the letters. This way you're not just rote memorizing sequences of letters. You're not just organizing MOP in order. You're actually drawing their attention to the sounds. And that's what's going to help kids to actually be able to figure out how to use that strategy when they are coming up and using that word in a different context. If you just have them memorize the letters without explaining to them and giving them a strategy for figuring out why those letters are sequenced the way that they are, it's going to be really hard for them to generalize, especially if you have a student who's struggling. Some kids can just kind of pick up on these things and make those connections without you needing to draw explicit attention to them. But as you know, a lot of kids on your caseload, they do need that direct instruction. So a lot of times when words become sight words, it's just because they're able to make those connections so automatically. It's not really because they're just memorizing sequences of letters. They're actually able to make the connections between the sounds and the words, and their brain just does it so quickly that it just seems like they are doing it rote memorization. But really they're not. They're just making those connections really quickly. So when you have a student who is struggling and sound it out just isn't working, what you can do is get in the habit of saying something like, let's think about the sounds. Now let's think about those letters. And so you can use this when you are looking at, when you are having kids spell words, and then it could be in reverse when you're working on having them decode words. It can be, let's think about those letters and let's think about those sounds. So it goes back and forth. And it's really important to work on this in both directions, so reading and spelling as well, because working on spelling can actually improve decoding skills, can improve reading skills. So that's super important. So instead of saying sound it out, say, let's think about those sounds, let's think about those letters. And this will help to make that strategy more specific. What that's going to do is explain what sound it out means. So Hope this was helpful. I wanted to draw your attention to a post that I just wrote on my blog. I will share a link in the comments below. But I do go further into number one, some strategies like sound it out, or some things that people say to kids when they are coming to a word and they don't know how to read or spell it that aren't necessarily helpful. I talk about why they're not helpful and what you can do instead to help kids along. And then I also talk about some essential components to literacy intervention that are really important to helping kids develop literacy skills. The article overall is about is it's a whole discussion on the impact of texting and technology on spelling and reading, but we can't think about how technology affects the literacy development of kids these days without thinking about, okay, what do kids actually need in order to develop those literacy skills? So I will share in the comments below a link to that whole article that will give you some more information about how to support kids' literacy. So thank you so much for listening, and check out that article in the comments below.